I'd lived in Willow Creek Estates for 7 years, long enough to know when the skies meant trouble. The creek that gave our neighborhood its name had a habit of swelling during heavy rain. And after last winter's storms, the soil behind the HOA clubhouse was cracked and unstable, a disaster waiting to happen. So when I saw the forecast calling for record rainfall, I sent an email to the HOA board. "You need to reinforce the drainage by the clubhouse," I wrote, including pictures of the erosion lines creeping toward the foundation. Otherwise, the next storm might flood it. They didn't respond. At the next HOA meeting, I stood up during the open forum, maps in hand, and explained my concerns again. Karen, the board president, a woman who treated her title like a royal decree, smirked. "We've been fine for 20 years, Daniel," she said. "We don't need panic or dramatics. Maybe focus on trimming your hedges instead." The room chuckled. I sat down, feeling like a fool. That night, I checked the weather radar again. 3 more days of storms ahead. I went out with a shovel, digging a shallow trench behind the clubhouse myself, hoping to divert some water. Halfway through, the HOA security guard, Tom, pulled up in his golf cart. "Got a work order for that?" he asked. "No," I said. "Just trying to keep the place dry." He radioed Karen. 10 minutes later, she arrived, umbrella in one hand, phone in the other. "Stop what you're doing," she barked. "You're trespassing on HOA property." "Karen, listen to me," I said. "The runoff will go straight toward the meeting hall. You need a barrier, at least some sandbags." I said stop. Rain began to fall harder, drumming against the pavement. She glared, snapped a photo of me, and said, "Expect a fine notice." 2 days later, the storm arrived in full force. Rain hammered the roofs, and the creek roared like a beast. I watched from my porch as the water climbed up the slope behind the clubhouse. By midnight, I could hear the sound of breaking glass. The runoff had finally found its way downhill, gushing through the rear doors of the HOA meeting room. Papers, chairs, and the smug portraits of past presidents floated inside like a twisted aquarium. I grabbed my camera and started recording. The HOA ignored my warnings. Now their precious meeting room was underwater. By sunrise, the storm had finally eased, but the damage was undeniable. The HOA clubhouse looked like a shipwreck stranded in a suburban sea. Mud covered the parking lot, and water still pooled inside the meeting room. The once pristine carpet squelched with every step, and the walls dripped with brown runoff. I showed up early, camera in hand, documenting everything: the cracked foundation, the collapsed back wall, the floating file cabinets. The smell of soaked paper and mildew was already setting in. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, stepping out of her SUV in shiny rain boots that were already useless. Her mouth fell open as she surveyed the mess. Behind her, a few board members stood speechless. This can't be happening," she muttered. "Oh, it's happening," I said, stepping beside her. "Remember that erosion issue I mentioned last week?" She turned sharply, glaring at me. "Don't start, Daniel. This is clearly the result of the storm, not some imaginary erosion." "Imaginary?" I pointed at the half-buried drain pipe sticking out of the mud like a broken straw. "That's your drainage system. It collapsed because you ignored it." Karen's jaw tightened. "We'll handle this internally." "Sure," I said, raising my phone. "But the county inspector might be interested in this too, especially since HOA funds were supposed to cover maintenance last spring." She froze. I knew I'd hit a nerve. The HOA had budgeted thousands for storm mitigation after the previous years. Floods, but no work was ever done. Rumor was the board redirected the money toward renovating the meeting room's interior instead of reinforcing the land around it. Now that same room looked like a fish tank. By noon, word had spread through the neighborhood. Residents gathered in clusters, snapping photos, shaking their heads. Someone muttered, "Guess the HOA finally drowned in their own rules." The board tried to keep people back, claiming the area was unsafe. But the damage was too public to hide. Even the local news van showed up by afternoon, interviewing neighbors about flood negligence. When the reporter approached me, I didn't hold back. I explained how I'd warned them multiple times, how they'd laughed me off, and how I'd even been fined for trying to dig a trench. That night, the HOA's group chat exploded with messages. Some residents demanded answers, others called for Karen's resignation. I sat on my porch, watching the water recede, and thought about karma. It didn't always come slow. Sometimes, it came rushing down a hill, muddy, and merciless. And something told me this wasn't over. The next HOA meeting, ironically held inside a borrowed church hall, was packed. Every resident who'd ever been fined for a garden, gnome, or a mailbox color showed up, ready for payback. Karen sat at the front table with the rest of the board, her smile thinner than ever. The projector behind her displayed a slide that read, "Flood Incident Response and Accountability." As soon as she cleared her throat, the shouting started. "You ignored us." Someone yelled. "My garage flooded because you didn't fix the drainage." Another resident added, "My HOA fees went to repainting that stupid meeting room." Karen banged her gavel. "Everyone, please. We're all victims of this storm. No one could have predicted the magnitude." That was my cue. I stood, holding up printed copies of my emails. "You were warned, Karen. Multiple times. With photos, timestamps, and everything." Dozens of heads turned toward me. Cameras from local reporters clicked. Karen's cheeks reddened. "Daniel, this isn't the time for personal attacks." "Personal attacks?" I said. "This is about responsibility. You fined me for trying to prevent the flood. You shut down my warning in front of everyone. And now the HOA has to pay thousands in repairs because of your pride." The room buzzed with murmurs. A board member named Steve nervously adjusted his glasses. "Maybe we should acknowledge that. Some concerns weren't properly addressed," he muttered. Karen shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Steve, we will handle this internally. The board will review all claims and—" A woman in the back stood up. "No, Karen, we're done with your reviews. We're calling for a vote to remove you as HOA president." Applause erupted. The air crackled with years of pent-up frustration. People had been waiting for this moment, someone to finally stand up to the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek. Karen's voice trembled. "You can't do that without notice." "Yes, we can," I said, holding up the HOA bylaws. Section 4.2, Emergency Vote of Confidence. When the board's negligence results in damage to community property, a majority vote can demand resignation. Steve looked at the crowd, then at Karen. "He's right." The residents raised their hands one by one, a sea of voices shouting, "Aye." Karen looked stunned. The power she'd clung to for years evaporated in seconds. As the crowd dispersed, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The creek behind the neighborhood gurgled softly, finally calm. Maybe now, I thought, the community could rebuild, literally and figuratively. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. And sure enough, the next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox marked "Legal Notice." The envelope was thick, too thick for anything good. I tore it open at my kitchen table and scanned the first line. Notice of legal action, defamation, and property damage. Karen had filed a lawsuit against me. According to her, I'd trespassed on HOA property, damaged common land with unauthorized digging, and made defamatory statements that resulted in emotional distress and reputational harm. In other words, she was trying to make me the scapegoat for her own failure. I laughed under my breath. Of course she did. By noon, the news had spread through the neighborhood group chat. Dozens of residents messaged me offering support. Some even volunteered statements proving I'd warned the board multiple times. One retired engineer, Mr. Lewis, came by with old HOA reports showing that the drainage system hadn't been maintained in years. It was all the proof I needed. A week later, the court date arrived. Karen strutted into the hearing room in her power suit, her lawyer trailing behind. I showed up with a binder full of evidence, emails, photos, timestamps, even video clips of the flood. When the judge asked me to explain, I stayed calm. "Your Honor, I tried to prevent this. I warned them about the erosion, even offered to help fix it. Instead, I was fined for trespassing." 2 days later, their meeting room was underwater. Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Did the HOA have documented maintenance for the drainage area? Silence. Karen shuffled papers, stammering. We had plans too." "Plans aren't maintenance," the judge interrupted. Case dismissed. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, the news crew was waiting again. Karen stormed past them, sunglasses on, refusing to comment. I, on the other hand, didn't mind saying a few words. I didn't want to be right, I told the reporter. I just wanted them to listen. That evening, a neighborhood email went out. The HOA announced Karen's permanent removal from the board and the appointment of a new committee dedicated to transparency and safety improvements. They even asked me to lead the new environmental oversight team. I accepted, but with one condition: no more ignored warnings. 2 months later, the creek's banks were reinforced. The clubhouse was repaired, and a new drainage system was in place. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates actually looked like a community rather than a battleground. Whenever it rained now, I'd watch the water flow safely into the new channels. No flooding, no panic, just quiet peace. And sometimes, when I passed by the newly rebuilt meeting room, I couldn't help but smile, because right there, on the wall above the entrance, hung a small plaque that read, "In memory of the flood we could have prevented, if only we'd listened."